from the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
And so rather than giving up his residual youthful conservatism and moving to the left, he fought the left, and that was unusual. But he had the kind of grounding that meant that he wasn't simply going to go with the winds.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was historian George Nash. We'll talk with him later on in today's program about the significance of William F. Buckley Jr. and the early history of the conservative movement here in the United States. First, we're joined by Dr. Richard Samuelson. He is Associate Professor of Government at Hillsdale College's Washington, D.C. campus. Dr. Samuelson, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Scott.
Appreciate it. We continue our conversations today through a series of talks surrounding 250th anniversaries, and this time around, the 250th anniversary of Lexington and Concord, April 19th, 1775. So let's go a few days, weeks, months before April 19th, 1775. Describe for us as we begin the interactions between the colonies of British America, the King and Parliament of Great Britain in those years leading up to the outbreak of hostilities.
Yeah, well, when I was last on to discuss the American Revolution, we discussed the Boston Tea Party, which took place at the end of 1773. And in reaction to that, the British passed what the Americans call the Intolerable Acts and what they call the Coercive Acts that specifically singled out Massachusetts, both to repay the tea, but they shut down Massachusetts government in general. And that was perhaps a bit of a blunder, because what it did is it consolidated support for Massachusetts in the colonies. At first, some people thought the Tea Party was excessive, but they thought the act of, if the Parliament could shut down the government of Massachusetts, replace it with a military governor, then they could do that to Virginia. And they also consolidated support in Massachusetts in places like Concord. The inland of Massachusetts thought perhaps the folks in Boston were a little crazy, but the reaction to the Tea Party, it did a great deal towards unifying the colony against the British. And what happened, because they shut down the regular government under the old charter as it was in practice, except for the governor who was appointed by the king, they created the Provincial Congress, which was meeting in Concord. So, and in the months between the First Continental Congress, which met in the fall of 74 and ended in October, and the battles of Lexington and Concord in April, there was kind of a waiting game, particularly in Massachusetts, as troops drilled and they practiced, and the governor, Gage, the royal military governor, was trying to figure out what exactly to do about the situation. So it was getting rather intense. And the way, the militia was, in principle, every adult male was supposed to be a member of the militia. But drilling, when times were quiet, was relatively sparse. It was a bit of a carnival day. The militia would turn out and they would have ritual drills, but then there'd be drinking and other things. But when times were serious, drills got much more serious. And that whole winter, there was a lot of serious work going on to prepare the Minutemen to participate in battles which they feared were all too likely.
Take us down that road a little bit farther on the Minutemen. Who were these Minutemen? What was the average American militia like around this time?
Well, in New England in particular, it was the adult males. John Adams said there were 4 institutions which were fundamental to shaping the character of the New Englanders, at least, so they could resist. They were, the town meetings, the schools, the militia, and the church, right? And so the militia was part of that. You were participating as an active citizen in the defense of your country, and in principle, every adult male was supposed to be part of that. This is before you had regular police force, too. what we call a regular police force might look like a standing army from the perspective of the founding era. So every adult male was supposed to be part of the defense of your town and your colony when summoned to do so. That's how it worked. And they were very worried about the example of Rome as they learned the history. They thought when Rome switched to full-time professional soldiers and stopped having the typical Roman be responsible for defense, that's when you moved from republic to empire.
The relation of the famous midnight ride of Paul Revere to this engagement of Lexington and Concord. Tell us, maybe not the full story, but a full-ish story about that ride and what perhaps some Americans don't know about it.
Okay, well, there are a few things. One is there was this nervous waiting game all winter, and the provincial Congress was inland, and Gage was trying to figure out what exactly to do about things. It was getting rather tense. He was in Boston, and remember back then Boston had a thin neck of land, and then which has been filled in, and to connect with the mainland. And he finally got orders in early April to go after the Congress. Meanwhile, among the militia, they said they were training harder and harder. It was getting very tense. And what happens is he finally gets orders, yes, go attack. And what plan should they use? Well, Worcester, they decided, is 50 miles away, just too far, too hilly to have a successful operation where in Worcester there were more military stores. Concord was closer. And it's also where Congress was. Sam Adams and John Hancock were there. So they come with a plan to go after the provincials in Concord. They have to go through Lexington to get there. And they want to have absolute secrecy for this plan, of course, which that secrecy does not last. They are betrayed by various reasons. I mean, they've sent spies out to Concord to scout the territory, and they were discovered. The Dr. Bliss, I believe it was, who entertained these spies, was found out, and he got very harsh treatment from the locals in general. But the other thing that happened is divisions in the town had been healed, so the town was fairly unified. And when the plans come through, finally, we're going to attack Concord. Gage tries to have complete secrecy, but the secret is betrayed. It's pretty obvious when his shock troops are told, oh, you're just taking the days off for rest. Everyone knows it's not really for rest. It's to prepare for battle. And so Paul Revere and Dawes they sneak out and get to Lexington. And at Lexington, I mean, Revere stops to get his horse changed. Horse can only ride so far,
Sure.
around midnight. And he kind of starts to say the bells peal, the militia turns out. And he and Dawes, though, are stopped by the pickets that the British has successfully set up. However, there's also young Dr. Barrett from a relatively highly placed Concord family who was dating someone in Lexington. And he also had heard about this, I think, through them. I can't remember the exact story, but he was able to kind of jump the fence and take the Bout Roads, which he knew very well from going back and forth a lot, to get the message to Concord that the British were coming through. So they stop Revere and Dawes are stopped at Lexington, but Barrett gets the message all the way through. Meanwhile, the bells are pealing. The militia turns out it's a bit of a mess because the militia's there. Well, they keep waiting for the British to show up. They retreat to the tavern. They go out, they go back, and finally in the morning, the British show up, and the Continentals, no, they're not Continentals yet. The militia is standing on Lexington Green, about 200 or so.
Mm-hmm.
The British command them to disperse, and some do, but many do not. And there's a lot of back and forth. It's not clear exactly how the first shots happened. The prevailing testimony from the American side is that the British shot first, but shots are fired at Lexington Green, and then all secrecy is gone. The militia starts peeling in from all over the countryside. The bells are ringing, church to church, town to town. So that's how you send messages up and down the road. And at that point in time, the British then continue marching towards, and they march with music, drums playing because it's too late, into Concord. And they get to Concord, and the town is actually pretty deserted. because the college, they retreated up past the Old North Bridge, and they go around town, and the Americans successfully threw a lot of the shot into the mill pond, so they couldn't get it. Hancock and Sam Adams are gone. They do get some supplies in some houses. There's some heroics where a woman successfully say, please don't go in that room. My mom is sick, things like that. And they convince, in certain cases, the militias not to go into the closet or little room that is holding supplies. But the confrontation finally happens at the Old North Bridge. And then the British are going to have to turn around.
More in just a moment with Richard Samuelson as he tells us about the battles of Lexington and Concord 250 years after the fact. I want to tell you about something happening right now. That's The Larry Arnn Show on the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. Each episode brings you Hillsdale College President Dr. Larry Arnn sitting down with guests of the college to talk about topics of enduring relevance. Most recently, Michael Ward, a C.S. Lewis scholar and theologian, joined Dr. Arnn to talk about why objective truth still matters. You also can find Dr. Arnn talking with Eric Prince, a Hillsdale graduate, about the future of dynamic warfare, or Sabin Howard on the intricate relationship between art, architecture, and the human experience. A great conversation. Up next on The Larry Arnn Show is an in-depth discussion with Bishop Robert Barron. I've heard it. It's wonderful. You'll want to hear it too. To do so, subscribe now to The Larry Arnn Show. You can go to podcast.hillsdale.edu, click the subscribe button, then choose Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, even YouTube. You'll know when that next episode and all future episodes are released. Join us on the Hillsdale College Podcast Network for The Larry Arnn Show, podcast.hillsdale.edu/subscribe. We continue our conversation with Dr. Richard Samuelson. So following that engagement at Concord, how did the retreat to the British forces to Boston proceed?
Well, not well for the British. The militia came in, they rallied, and back then, the regular troops march in uniform, in regular patterns down the road. The militia, of course, were irregular. Well, they were militia, but they were perfectly happy to line up in the trees and the woods and around and start picking off troops, which the British, being professionals, regarded as cowardly. You're supposed to meet your enemy in battle, stand before them, and shoot them, right? And the Americans are picking them off all the way clear back to Lexington, where reinforcements arrived. Had they not showed up in Lexington, there would have been many troops left by the time they got back to Boston. And that angered the soldiers, the regular soldiers, the British, even more. What happened, because they thought that is not fair play, right? It should be, if I'm going to be a regular soldier who is ready for battle on the field of battle, you should be that way as well. And this would be an ongoing theme with some of the mistreatment of the Americans by the British, different understandings of what it is to engage in war. By the way, Washington very much wanted to develop regulars. And by the time we leave Valley Forge, thanks to the great work of Baron von Steuben, we do have regular troops, but it's a quest because they were not really up to the standards of the full-time English troops. Mm-hmm. But the key story here, though, of course, is the British lost a lot of men on the retreat from Concord to Lexington. And then they retreat to Boston, where the siege starts. And militia from all over Massachusetts and then beyond start rallying in outside of Boston, and the British are holed up inside of Boston.
How would you contrast the differences in tactics between the British and the colonial militias?
Well, as I said, the British were prepared for they were regular troops from Europe, used to the battlefields of Europe. They were used to facing off against the French in the battlefield, and there were certain rules of engagement that developed over the previous centuries. And of course, this is part of the Age of Enlightenment, the effort to limit the ways in which one engaged in war. Washington, who was raised to a colonel in the French and Indian War, fighting in the backcountry in what's now probably West Virginia, parts of Pennsylvania, that area back there. He learned this just doesn't work in many parts of what's now the United States. This was still those areas that are more frontier-like. That way of doing battle simply is not going to work. It will work, and Washington very much wanted that when he had pitched battles closer to the East Coast, but it was more situational, and you had to know what you were doing. This is what Washington learned on that terrible march, Braddock's march inland, when they got butchered by the French and the Indians, right? Braddock thought they were, can march single file or in a few in a row down the road and they'd be safe, and they got slaughtered. And so then there's a sense that when you don't blame yourself for screwing up, you blame the other people for not playing by the rules. So you have a lot of anger is developed that the Americans are not just damn rebels. And of course, rebels are people committing treason are treated like pirates. They should not deserve the laws of war, which would produce the horrible mistreatment of American prisoners during the war that Washington would protest. And the Americans would learn perhaps the wrong lesson that, our militia is sufficient to kick the British out. And of course, that really isn't enough. They would come in and they could help a lot, but there are cases where you really did need a well-trained, something like a professional army, which we did get through the course of the war.
Talking with Dr. Richard Samuelson about Lexington and Concord, April 19th, 1775, 250 years ago. How did Lexington and Concord perhaps influence public opinion around the colonies?
Well, it's interesting because John Adams thought, as others did, once the sword is drawn, throw away the scabbard. That is, there really is not much of a choice except independence. Others were much more reluctant, that they realized things are much more intense. And there was a plan after the first Congress, meet in the spring if necessary. Well, they're going to meet in the spring for the second Congress in May. So you're going to be a month after Lexington and Concord. And the result of that, George Washington shows up in his uniform. Well, hint, hint. Although Joseph Ellis said, well, maybe that was his best fitting suit of clothes. Odds are no. And so the colonists have to decide, they are still colonists. What do we do? What's prudent? And their discussions in Congress, what does it mean? Because now you have an army of all these militia, but they are not under any authority. So the first person in the Continental Army is Washington, who was nominated by John Adams. There's a lot of pushing and shoving. Should Massachusetts troops, New England troops be under a New Englander or not? And Adams, while this discussion is going on, finally says, look, I'm just going to nominate Washington. And that ends discussion. And Washington becomes the commander-in-chief. And then from there, he's going to try to take over these troops. And he's not entirely impressed by the troops. So they're not what he would like. New England troops are not used to obeying commands like normal troops. They're used to electing their officers, which is not terribly good for the chain of command. But Washington would learn to appreciate their virtues during the course of the war. But when the Congress meets, they have to figure, what do we do about this army? We are now at war. What does it mean? Mm-hmm. And there is a big move in public opinion towards, okay, now things are really serious with the British. Independence is kind of the back of people's heads, is the front of people's heads for those who kind of think, well, it's too late to fix anything. But the fundamental contours of the discussion have changed now. And now, are they just rebelling? Can they keep fighting till the British stop? Or are you going to have to take the next step? That's kind of the background of every discussion they have. And Adams is impatient, and he makes a bit of an ass of himself, if I say that here, that by pushing too hard, guys, get over it. They're not coming back. It's time for independence. Because prudence dictates you have to wait till everybody's ready for that. And it takes another year or more till there is enough sufficient public opinion for that. And so in the summer, they're going to give the olive branch petition to the king, which is met by the king declaring that the Americans are out of his protection, that he refuses to recognize the olive branch petition. So there was a big phase shift. It's not all the way against the British yet, but it's a huge move in that direction. Where you had the coercive acts, they attack one government, attacks another one, as they say. You're shutting down Massachusetts' regular government, putting a military government, among other things, sending people to foreign places for trial. And then there is actual blood. There is fighting. And so there's the rally effect, which scholars talk about, happens way back then as well.
As we close, how should we remember, or what lessons perhaps should we draw from looking back on these events on April 19th, 1775, Lexington and Concord.
It's interesting, the memory of Lexington and Concord. It used to be school children would all learn the midnight ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April of 75. Hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. That is not part of our regular education anymore. And one lesson is how we remember these things. The memory of the revolution as part of our common civic understanding is fading. Maybe some of this discussion, the 250th, will bring some of that back, because it's part of being a country that you have your common stories you share, and we've lost that in a world where, not long ago, Johnny Horton gave a song about the Battle of New Orleans, and people would know what it was. That wouldn't work anymore. We've lost that common history. So just like Lexington and Concord, other great battles and fights, we have lost that element of our history. So that's one element, is it's important to know this. And another element is the common participation. This was not just an elite-led group. This was very much across the board that the colonists in general, the prevailing view, Adams says a thumbnail sketch is a third were with us, a third against us, and a third were inshore. There's some truth to that, but it's it's probably more like 20% against, and the ones who are inshore, more of them probably lean towards us than against. But it's very much a popular movement. There was a consensus, and you have to move with the consensus in any serious political action, and especially a war. And they were very careful about that. Washington was very good about that. Along the way, he's also very good in respecting the civilian over military, that he was under civilian command, even if he was the most important person in the country. And so it's important to remember Lexington and Concord, finally, what's this about? It is about free government. The British were trying to replace free government with military government, and our right to self-rule via the democratic process. We call it the democratic process. They would not call it that. But electing your own leaders, participating, public discussion. That's being part of the militia is the same thing. We defend ourselves. That's all part of the same story of equal independent citizens who are part of a larger community.
Dr. Richard Samuelson, Associate Professor of Government at Hillsdale College's Washington, D.C. campus, as we talk the 250th anniversary of Lexington and Concord, April 19th, 1775. Dr. Samuelson, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Scott.
Up next, historian George Nash joins us. We'll talk about the significance of William F. Buckley Jr. during the 100th anniversary year of his birth. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. It's no secret that Americans are more divided than ever. And it's not just over what policies will improve our great country. No, it's over whether America is great at all, whether America deserves our love. That's why Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, Imprimis has featured speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Molly Hemingway, Andy Puzder, Harmeet Dillon, and Chris Rufo. Over 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free. And I urge you to sign up for it today at no charge. To get your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now. Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network at podcast.hillsdale.edu. Find older episodes of this program plus all the great Hillsdale College audio. podcast.hillsdale.edu. We're joined by George Nash, American historian, a chronicler of the conservative movement, the author of The Conservative Intellectual Movement Since 1945. George, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Talking today about William F. Buckley and the beginnings of the conservative movement, I read an interview with you, and you said in 1945, end of World War II, no articulate, coordinated, self-consciously conservative intellectual force existed in the United States. Can you paint a picture for us of what it was like to hold those conservative beliefs during that time? What of there, if anything, was of conservatives at that point?
There was no organized conservative movement really in the United States in an intellectual sense at the end of World War II. We had just been through the years of the Great Depression, the New Deal, the war itself, and there was a feeling that the people on the left were the people who were going to remake the world and rebuild the world after the terrible war. And those who felt that the world had been moving in a bad direction toward more statism, totalitarianism, etc., they felt that history was passing them by. And so there were a number of voices out there, but they were not very coordinated, voices of protest. In the famous words of William F. Buckley, about whom we'll say more in a moment, they were standing athwart history yelling, "Stop." So they felt like a minority, an endangered minority, and one which was very much against the tide of events.
William F. Buckley, many of our listeners, most of our listeners are familiar with William F. Buckley, but perhaps more with Buckley later in his life. Who was William F. Buckley at this point, 1955, around the beginning of National Review and the start of this conservative movement? Who was William F. Buckley?
Yes. Well, I'll give a couple of basic biographical facts. Buckley was born in 1925. After serving in the military in World War II, he entered Yale University. His father was a wealthy conservative Texas oilman. He came from a very large Roman Catholic family, 6th of 10 children. And Buckley was catapulted into fame by the publication of a book highly critical of his alma mater. Buckley went to Yale, graduated class of 1950, and he had been brought up to be a devout Christian, an anti-communist, and also what they called in those days an individualist, what we today would probably call a libertarian or a free market conservative. And Buckley, as he lived at Yale and became a big man on campus, a famous debater and popular man in the social scene and all of that. Buckley, while personally popular, was very concerned and dismayed by the drift of things at Yale, particularly in the classroom. Keynesian economics, left-wing economics was taking over in the teaching. Christianity was being de-emphasized and marginalized, and some of the professors and the faculty were openly disparaging of Christianity in the classroom. And he said, this is not what Yale used to stand for, and it seemed that there was a collectivist onslaught. And also it was being advanced, that onslaught, in the hallowed name of academic freedom. So you couldn't really touch it. It just had to be that way. Buckley wrote a book called God and Men at Yale, which he published in 1951, which was his analysis and expose of these trends and his demand that something be done to reverse them. And he didn't just stop with documenting the collectivist and secularizing influence at work on the campus. He said that the not the trustees, but the alumni who had received an education from Yale and were, in a sense, the consumers of Yale's product, that they should rise up and impose a new orthodoxy on the liberal left-wing orthodoxy, which was taking root at Yale, a more Christian, free market-oriented orthodoxy, if you will. And that was a highly unusual notion at the time, and it caused apoplexy among many of the faculty at Yale and elsewhere. Well, he published a book in 1951, and it became a bestseller. Well, that was not probably his expectation. But he was helped along inadvertently, you might say, by the reaction of the Yale faculty and administration. They did not take kindly to this book. A rain of vituperation rained down upon Buckley's head in the next several months from people who were outraged at what they thought was a distortion of the facts. Well, that didn't change things much at Yale, but it made him a national media sensation. The book became a bestseller, and here he is only 26 years old shortly after the book appeared, so still a young guy. And it made him a leader or at the forefront of this kind of explosion, which got national attention. And in the next few years, Buckley did a lot of debating around the country. He also published another book called McCarthy and His Enemies, which was a defense of Senator Joseph McCarthy, the anti-communist Red Hunter, as Buckley called him in a later book about him, the Red Hunter. And Buckley became even more famous or notorious. It was a scandal as far as the left was concerned. They thought he was an authoritarian, maybe even a fascist, and ignorant and vicious and so on. He was called all sorts of names, but it made him famous, and it encouraged in him a desire to do something more than just write critically about it. And that something in 1955 became the founding of or creation of a magazine, his magazine, called National Review. And I have to stress to the listeners here, there was no other conservative journal of opinion in the United States at the time. And he wanted to make this a forum for intelligent conservative discourse and critique of these trends that they had been standing athwart for so long. He wanted to change the direction of things.
Because there was now something where there was nothing with National Review in 1955, was there a sense immediately that something was happening, that something was brewing among those who had these beliefs in the country?
Yes, there were three broad groupings of people who had been doing some writing in that decade after the war ended. In brief, we would call them traditionalist conservatives like the Michigan author and distinguished conservative scholar Russell Kirk, free market advocates like Friedrich Hayek, who wrote The Road to Serfdom in 1944, and then very strong anti-communist Cold Warriors, some of whom had been communists themselves earlier and had turned against it. So there were three thrusts, therefore, to what you might call conservative dissent. And Buckley's desire, his goal, his challenge was to bring these three rather separate groupings together under one journalistic roof so that there could be a more coordinated and intellectually satisfying response to the left-wing predominance in the media.
George Nash is with us, author of The Conservative Intellectual Movement Since 1945, talking about William F. Buckley and the beginnings of the conservative movement. Your book, The Conservative Intellectual Movement Since 1945, at length examines two big questions. What, besides a common foe, would hold these groups together, these intellectuals together? So in essence, what is conservatism? And then what is conservatism in America? People can read the book to find the lengthy answer. Could you give us a short answer?
Yes. Well, conservatives came from all different directions, and they didn't necessarily have the same basic priorities. And there disputes arose among them between the traditionalists and the libertarians, to use the language of the categories. And so Buckley was looking for a way, and others with him at his magazine, to bring some blending of these perspectives together so that they could collaborate and also collaborate with some philosophical consistency. So there's a search for a kind of a philosophic underpinning for all of this. And secondly, they had to meet attacks from the left. Liberals have said, oh, conservatives, those are Neanderthals from Europe, no relevance to the United States. The United States has always been a liberal Lockean country, and these people are just flaky eccentrics. And if not worse, they might be yahoos and nativists and conspiracy theorists and even anti-Semites and so forth, not respectable people. So what Buckley was trying to do was to show that there was intellectual viability philosophically, and also intellectual respectability, and also that America in many ways was a conservative country, and America had a tradition of freedom that ought to be conserved, if you will, an American tradition of limited government as opposed to ever-expanding government, the administrative state, the welfare state, etc. And also America was conserving the values of Western civilization, including the Judeo-Christian religious tradition, in the face of attack from the communists, who were atheists by definition and anti-capitalist by definition. And so communism was a threat that everybody, or opposition to communism, was something that all of these groups on the right could share. It was common ground. And Buckley, in a way, personified that in his own belief system and also in his practices as an editor.
Buckley came from money. He went to Yale. He enjoyed sailing and classical music and loved Bach and dinner parties. Was the way that conservatism developed during this time influenced at all by his background? And was that in any way an advantage or a disadvantage to the appeal of what he was doing at the time?
Well, when Buckley came on the scene, he was very polished. He had a good education. He had been to private school, and all of that. He was articulate, had quite a vocabulary. He was obviously already a facile writer and became really a very great writer, as well as a very, very productive writer. So he had a good education. So he belied the stereotype that only liberals were intelligent and conservatives, if they called themselves that, or right-wingers, were somehow humorless and dull, ignorant, and so on. And when he came on the scene, Time magazine said that he was a rebel in reverse, and they called him a fire-eating young conservative. Only left-wingers are supposed to be young and fire-eating. So he was young and debonair, and that caught attention. And because of his skills and his educational patina, his panache, his style, if you will, all of that helped break through what I called the wall of liberal condescension, and shatter the stereotype that conservatives are necessarily dumb or evil, even. So Buckley became a kind of a happy warrior, if you will, who could meet the liberals on their own terms, and because of his debating skills and all, do very well against them.
Where did Buckley himself find the underpinnings for his philosophy?
I think they came from his family environment. I mentioned that his father was very conservative. It was a very conservative Catholic family, and Buckley said he never had doubts about his Christian faith. He was brought up a Christian. So that's one major source. His father was a businessman and therefore had some of the businessman's suspicion of overregulation by the state. Also, his father was kicked out of Mexico by Mexican leftists at the time of revolutionary ferment in Mexico in the late teens and early 20s of the 20th century. And his father was ever afterward a staunch anti-communist, anti-radical. And all of those influences Buckley imbibed, you could say, at home. So when he went to Yale, he wasn't adrift. He had moorings, and he saw the college standing for things antithesis to what he had been brought up. And so rather than giving up his residual youthful conservatism and moving to the left, he fought the left, and that was unusual. But he had the kind of grounding that meant that he wasn't simply going to go with the winds.
Talking with George Nash, American historian, chronicler of the conservative movement, author of the conservative intellectual movement since 1945. In this first decade or so, say post-National Review, 1955, who's listening? Who's paying attention to these new conservatives in the U.S.?
Well, it starts small with 8,000 or 10,000 subscribers, but it obviously reached an audience rather quickly. Buckley's magazine became a kind of general staff for the development of it, was becoming conservative, more self-conscious conservatism. And this began to flourish, this phenomenon, in the early 60s with the rise of the Goldwater phenomenon. Goldwater, Senator Barry Goldwater, the Republican presidential candidate in 1964, had written in 1960 a book which sold, I think, 3 million plus copies, called The Conscience of a Conservative. And this is no secret, it was ghostwritten by Buckley's brother-in-law and best friend, a man named Brent Bozell. So there was popular awareness. And Kennedy comes in, John Kennedy, and he seems to be moving the country to what he called a new frontier, moving it to the left. And there is a resistance to that on the right. And National Review becomes the kind of the central magazine for disseminating that viewpoint in intelligent, persuasive ways. And Buckley, by the mid-60s, was on his way to becoming obviously a leader of this force, but also moving into the mainstream in various ways that we might discuss. He became a candidate for mayor of New York City in 1965 as a conservative. He didn't win, but he made conservatism much more visible and audible to a lot of voters, and that led a couple of years later to his being on the cover of Time magazine. His cover story about him in 1967 with the caption, "Conservatism can be fun." And so he again was belying these older liberal stereotypes that conservatives could be just dismissed, unimportant, and so forth. And also, and quite importantly, in Buckley's development as a public figure, this came about right after the mayoral campaign of 1965, in which he was very clever on the debates that the mayoral candidates had and so on. And so he made a name for himself. In 1966, he started Firing Line. It was a 1-hour interview show, usually with one guest, in which they would discuss, hash out, and argue about all sorts of issues. He had a vast spectrum of people on that show. That was a very important breakthrough moment, I think, for Buckley personally and for the conservative cause. And I should just say, since we're talking to a media-sensitive audience here, that show, Firing Line, lasted 33 years, and Buckley had more than 1,500 episodes. The man was a worker. And he not only did that, but he influenced, I know, so many people who were impressed by his mental and verbal agility, his urbanity, his wit. He was very witty, very humorous. And all of this attracted many people to him, and that gave a hearing to his beliefs, you see. So Buckley, by the late 60s, was a leading national voice for conservatism and also a celebrity, even. He had broken out of that ghetto, you might say, of the right wing.
I want to back up to Goldwater for just a moment, because the Goldwater nomination and candidacy could be looked at as a great victory, because now these ideas are being seen on a national level. At the same time, the actual election itself could be seen as a big loss because Goldwater was wiped out. How does Buckley and this movement react to the reaction to Goldwater's campaign in 64?
Well, for one thing, Buckley wanted, and he started even before the election, to drive to the periphery of conservatism those who were really beyond the pale of respectability. Or, in particular, he attacked the John Birch Society, which had a considerable following for a time in the early 60s. But it was built on the theory that the dangers that America faced in the world were the cause not simply of the communists abroad, but of communists within, who were distorting American foreign policy. And Robert Welch, the founder, claimed that President Eisenhower was, and I'm quoting now from memory, Welch's dismissal of Eisenhower as an conscious, articulate instrument of the communist conspiracy. And Buckley said, "You can't believe that. This is so ridiculous. This kind of conspiracy thinking, that's not going to get the movement very far." But the Goldwater campaign had several results. First, it disastrously defeated Goldwater, and it led to enormous Democratic majorities under Lyndon Johnson. So in public policy, the country lurched to the left, the Great Society. But the Great Society rather quickly ran into trouble, and so there was a reaction against it, and Buckley, of course, was there to articulate a strong conservative case against it. It also led to two other important factors going forward politically. One, it enabled the conservatives who had nominated Goldwater to take over the organizational machinery of most Republican Party state organizations. That's very important. Goldwater lost the election, but the party apparatus was now controlled by Goldwaterites who would then be looking for some other candidate in the future. And thirdly, it created a new political voice for conservatism in Ronald Reagan, who gave that famous speech in support of Goldwater on TV just before the election. And it was so well done that it evoked, I think, millions of dollars in responses from people, and it made Reagan a national sensation.
So, yes, Ronald Reagan, who's a supporter of Barry Goldwater, speaks for Barry Goldwater, this politician who's a National Review reader and eventually ascends to the presidency in 1980.
Yes.
How much should we connect Reagan's ascendance, the Reagan agenda, to what Buckley began in 1955 with National Review?
Well, as you just said, Reagan read National Review from the beginning. The two men became acquainted in 1961, and their friendship deepened in time. And Buckley was articulating these core views of limited government, free market capitalism, and what we might call, in a way, social conservatism, and the defense of the social order against unlawful attempts to disrupt it and so forth. Some of the turmoil of the 60s that was related in part to the Vietnam War protests and the like. So National Review was really the central magazine, and Reagan was an avid reader of that. And Reagan was a reader. He was a student. People don't think of him that way, but I think the research shows it. So when all of that was happening, Buckley was there, in a sense, in an advisory role. And I have made the point elsewhere that Buckley was not quite a tutor to Reagan. Reagan learned from many sources, but Reagan learned from Buckley's magazine. And during Reagan's presidency, Reagan frequently received advice from Buckley quietly on personnel matters and other significant matters in running the administration. And it has been said by one of Reagan's biographers that Buckley was probably Reagan's closest advisor, really most trusted advisor outside the immediate official family of the president. So Buckley continued to have an influence that way, even though from 1980 on there were, you might say, two maestros, the maestro Buckley, and then now the political one implementing, you might say, some of the Buckley vision of things that occurred under President Ronald Reagan.
We only have a moment left, but I want to ask this question. I talked to Lawrence Perlman recently about his book, his friendship with William F. Buckley. And something we talked about was his openness and his ability to encourage younger Americans to be involved and to have them part of the movement. How did he see that his influence would continue decades into the future in terms of mentoring, encouraging younger Americans to be involved and to take up the mantle?
I think a couple of points could be made quickly. One, Buckley was always on the lookout for talent, young talent, and often he was incredibly generous and helpful in placing people and giving them a break as they started up the ladder. He was very attentive to that. Secondly, he was an institution builder. He literally patronized the founding of Young Americans for Freedom, the conservative youth organization of the 60s, in his living room of the family home in Connecticut. That was done in 1960. And Buckley did other things that were similar in character to build up institutions which would make conservatism more than just the expression of a moment. He gave the first check to found the Philadelphia Society, the nation's oldest and to this day, the preeminent organization, society of conservative intellectuals in the United States. So he had that kind of long-range vision, farsightedness, and also, again, his whole persona, I think, was attractive to many young people. This man with flair, articulateness, and seemed to be enjoying life and just outrunning the competition. This will sound perhaps a bit of a stretch, but I sometimes think of Buckley as the roadrunner, and the Liberals were Wile E. Coyote, always trying to catch up, but they never catch up with him. He was so deft and energetic and so on, and was a very good public face for conservatism in the years of his prime.
George Nash, American historian and chronicler of the conservative movement, his well-known book, The Conservative Intellectual Movement Since 1945. George, thank you so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Dr. Richard Samuelson from Hillsdale in D.C. and George Nash. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.